Welcome to Cash Plays. And now your host, Bart Hanson.
Hello and welcome to another week of Cash Plays, July 30th, Value. And this is going to be one of the first episodes where we have not had a guest on in quite some time. It's just going to be me talking, and I've got a lot of emails that you guys have sent over the last few weeks that I'm going to get to. First off, kind of some custodial issues. I'm doing some experimentation with Skype. Now, of course, you can email the show at cashplays@pokerroad.com, but I kind of wanted to increase the amount of, voicemails coming in, and someone had emailed me and suggested that I start a Skype account, which I went ahead and did for a number of reasons. I think what I'm going to start doing is interview people over Skype so that I'm not necessarily restricted to, having people on the show when they're in town, when it's in LA, or when we were both in Las Vegas or something like that. Now, hopefully I can get anyone at any time. And I hear this is something that the training sites do a lot of too when they do dual training, where they'll have a guy on a microphone, another guy on Skype, and then they'll do a recording of it. So if you want to help me test it out, and again, if you want to get on the show, you can send a voicemail over at 323-743-8404. Again, 323-743-8404. Or you can Skype Bart Hanson. I have a voicemail set up, and my last name is Hanson. So send a couple of messages. And I think what my idea with what I might want to do with Skype, if this works out, is possibly, designate an hour or two a week at a specific time where we can do a live call-in. And maybe part of each week's show, especially if we don't have a guest on, can be devoted to, say, 10 or 15 minutes of live hand analysis where somebody calls in with a hand. I've kind of gotten away from talking about hands that are emailed in just because I found when I listened back to the show, I myself got a little bit lost. I mean, you can get a little dry. So recently I've been just taking emails that have general theoretical questions and strategic questions. But again, I want to experiment with live call-in hand analysis. So, maybe I'll say, okay, I'm going to take calls from Thursday from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. And those of you that want to call into that time or Skype me can do that, and I will just take the calls randomly. And, we'll work from there and maybe take the best 2 or 3 hands, out of that and include it for a segment of the show. This is where I want your help. Anybody out there that knows a lot about podcasting, I'm relatively new to this stuff. I just got a new USB recorder, and normally what I do is I use my Marantz solid-state professional recorder to record the shows. But when I'm going to be using Skype and doing interviews, I'm going to be using my computer and this USB mic. So, I want everyone to kind of give me feedback as to how the quality sounds, and we might try it out for the first time next week. But I also want to know if anybody has some suggestions about what type of software is best to record Skype conversations, or any type of other information that would just make the show, better overall for me. Again, what my intention is to use Skype and use some sort of software to record the conversations, whether it's with the guest or a call-in, and then use some sort of MP3 editor and put the show together. But again, if anyone has experience doing this, shoot an email or shoot over a voicemail over to Skype, 323-743-8404, and help me out a little bit, because this is going to be a little bit of a learning process over the next few weeks. With that being said, this week's show is Value. And the reason why I named this week's show Value is because I really think that the state of no limit games these days is all about extracting maximum value. And we've talked about this a lot on the show, in past weeks, that early on, say 2, 3, 4 years ago, normally the best line to extract maximum value would be to say, fast play your hand, put a lot of money in with good hands all the time, which, again, I think for the most part is still true. But I think where you go and you become, say, a medium winning player to a big winning player, is extracting maximum value with marginal hands against other marginal hands. Anytime you can take a line that gets the most money in from an inferior hand is going to be the best way to play that hand. And I'll give you an example. And this was something that a hand that I played, I think it was a couple days ago, where someone was in a straddle spot at Commerce in 1020 and someone posted from behind. So there's some dead money out there. And I opened under the gun +3 with ace 6 of clubs. So I had a suited ace. There's dead money in there. I think I opened a 160, which is about a pot size raise. It got folded around to the straddle. And the straddle he's not an overly aggressive player, but, a little bit aggressive. He might overvalue some hands. And he calls. So now the pot's about $330, $340 with the dead money in there. Okay. Well, the board comes out ace 9 deuce. Rainbow. He checks to me. Now I've got ace 6 here, and this is, kind of an interesting situation with top pair where there really isn't a card that can hurt me because, I do have the highest pair with an ace. So what do I do? Do I bet? Do I check? And I actually took the line of checking. And it's not because I'm slow playing the hand. If I had a hand like ace king or ace queen, and I thought that there was a fairly good chance that this guy would call me with a weaker ace or anything else, then I would bet that flop almost always with ace king or ace queen. But with ace 6, again, value, way ahead, way behind, I just figured that if I'm betting that flop on an undrawy board, there's just no possible way I can get any type of value from a hand that I'm beating. So by checking back, it allows me to A, let the guy catch up a little bit with maybe a higher second pair on the turn, or B, induce a bluff. Because if I'm going to bet there and I'm going to get queen jack or king queen to fold and I can only get called by aces, there's just no value in betting whatsoever. So I check back and lo and behold, the turn's a queen. Well, now the guy comes out and he bets. I think he bet about 60% of the pot, and I called. He bet about $230 or $240, and I called. So now the pot's like $600-$700. The river is a total offsuit card, and now he checks to me. Now, if I have a read on the guy that he might have an ace or that he would never call me on the river without an ace, then I'll check that back. And it's kind of a similar line where if I had checked back second pair on the flop and then a guy bet into me and I called the turn, say the board had come out, queen jack 3, and he checked me and I bet ace jack and I checked back ace jack. Now the guy bet out on the turn. And I called. Now the river he checked. Well, it's very difficult for me it's very difficult for me to get called by a hand that I beat on the river there with second pair. Now in this case, with just the ace out there, I actually made a very tiny small value bet. I bet about 25%. And the guy thought. I bet about $200 to $250, and he called. And I ended up winning, in the end, over $1,000 pot with ace 6. He had king queen because I checked back the flop. Now, if I had bet the flop, he just would have folded. He had totally missed. But by checking back, he gets a little bit confused. And he's like, well, why would the guy check back there? And then he said to me at the end of the hand, well, are you slow playing? And no, I'm not slow playing. And what it does is, it manages the size of the pot with a medium strength hand. And it allows me to extract value from inferior hands that would not call the flop. Now, my example, I love to do that with second pair. Just like I just threw that example out where, I raise with ace jack and the board comes out queen jack 3. Your hand has enough showdown value where I really do like checking back the flop. And then if the guy checks to you on the turn, maybe bet or calling their turn bet and then evaluating a river bet. Now, with that hand with ace-6, if the guy had checked the turn to me, of course I'm going to make a small bet. And then if he calls, I'm going to evaluate the river. But, to win hundreds of dollars per hand with a marginal hand, I really think separates the men from the boys. So when you're thinking about playing a marginal hand, try to figure out the best way to extract value from an inferior hand. And a lot of times, the best way is actually not by betting, it's by checking. And again, we've talked about, you get into this whole thing and people say, well, why don't you slow play? Well, your sets there, your top sets. Well, that's because I think you lose too much value. On the off chance that somebody has something that they'll call you with on the flop, you're just losing too much value. We're talking about hands that have medium strength hands that really can't necessarily stand a check raise, like betting second pair on a flop, or betting top pair in a weak, with a weak kicker. You bet that flop with ace-6, you really can't stand a check raise. So you're managing the size of the pot and you're getting other inferior hands to call, and you're extracting value. And, we'll talk about this more on later shows, but it really, really is one of the biggest keys to winning some extra money in no-limit hold'em games. Second interesting hand that I played this week, and I really am starting to do something that I've never really done before, and that's really trying to put my opponents on a hand, on a range of hands. And of course, you say, well, of course you always put your opponent on a range of hands, but I'll give you this example, where, say, 6 to 12 months ago, I would just give up on the turn. But now I really tried to think of what my opponent had. Again, Commerce 1020 a couple days ago. The villain in the hand started off with something like 15 or 1600. I raised it up with King Queen offsuit to 80, which is my standard raise in that game. And he called. Pot's about, 180, something like that. The board comes out ace 8-10 with 2 diamonds. Now, draw a heavy board, not terribly bad board texture, because a lot of times if a guy doesn't have an ace there, he's going to fold. But you have to also realize that if you bet there and the guy calls, he doesn't necessarily have an ace, and I'm out of position. So I threw a $150 continuation bet in, and the guy thought for a second, and he called. Now again, the board is ace 8-10 with a couple diamonds. Well, I'm thinking to myself, obviously he could have a draw. He could have a weak ace. He could have a big ace. Starting him to put him on a range right there. And I don't necessarily know what it is yet. And this is where I think live play, if you're a good live player, you have a big advantage over, playing online. When you can start reading those people. And you talk, Negreanu talked about the presence of physical tells. Seeing how the guy calls, the flop. Right there, I didn't get a good tell as to what he had on the flop. Okay, 150 call. 300 now, pot's now 460. Turns an offsuit deuce. Now, again, in my old days, I would just say, I'm just going to check and give up. I don't want to throw away money. However, now that turn is an offsuit deuce, I'm thinking to myself, if I make a pretty hefty bet here, like something like 400, 350 to 400, I think that A, I can get him to fold a weak ace. And if he just has a dry flush draw, which is diamonds, I think that I'm going to get him to fold diamonds. And obviously, if I bet and he makes a raise, he's got better than a one pair plus hand, it's an easy fold. But I thought with that specific board and with my bet on the flop and the fact that he just smooth called, I could get a lot of information here. Because, and again, on such a drawy board and with the possibility that the guy has an ace, I think betting half pot is wrong. I think this is a spot where, like we talked about before, you make a hefty bet, a hefty size bet, to make sure your opponent isn't floating you. Not that this guy was capable of floating me, but it just gives you more of a feel for where the guy is at in the hand. So ace, 8, 10, couple diamonds, turns an offsuit deuce. I bet 400. He immediately calls. Now this is what we talk about in live play. Let's think again and, take a thought of what we thought the guy had. So he's got a diamond draw, some sort of draw, right? We'll say diamond draw, could be straight draw, diamond draw, or an ace. or a big hand that we expect him to raise the turn with. So the way that he immediately just flat calls on that draw board, I dismiss a big hand. He doesn't have a set. He doesn't have top two pair. If you were to have a weak ace, something like ace 5 or ace 6, I really think that he would think about it. He wouldn't just immediately call. If he ran into two pair, same thing. If he had like an ace deuce and he ran into two pair, he's going to think about what he's going to do. He's not just going to immediately call. Normally, when you're playing against a guy that's live, a quick call like that with this given action is some sort of draw. Now, if he did just have naked diamonds here, and again, this is my thought process, it's really a big bet. And again, a guy is going to take a couple of seconds before he calls because he's going to try to figure out, well, the guy's betting 400. I only have, after he makes the $400 call, he only has another 12 or 1300 left. Is it worth it for him to call almost a pot-sized bet there? But because he called so quickly, I think that there is a very, very good chance that he had a combination draw. What I mean by that as a combination draw is a diamond draw and a straight draw, or a diamond draw and he's run into a pair, or he had a pair on the flop. Now the board was ace, 10, 8, ace of diamonds, 10 of diamonds, 8 offsuit. Turn was an offsuit deuce. So I think he can have diamonds and an 8. He could have diamonds and a deuce, or he could have a flush draw, straight draw. It makes sense that this is what this guy has in the hand. He's got 1200 left, or a little bit less than that. The pot is now 1200. Of course, I have him covered. So what do I have to do here with king queen? Trust my read on the river. Well, my hand with king queen does not have showdown value against a flush draw and a pair. If he's got a flush draw and a straight draw and he bricks out, so be it. But I cannot check the river because I don't know. I think he's got one of those two hands, but I don't want to be stupid and check it down and lose to a deuce. So I'm thinking to myself, well, I've got to bet this river again here, make it look like I've got a monster hand if the diamond doesn't come. Because again, I don't put this guy on an ace. I think he has to have a combo flush draw, straight draw, flush draw, pair draw, pair. So the river comes an offsuit 9. Ace 8, 10, deuce 9. I take a green chip, Commerce is $1,000 chip, and I bet 1,000 into $1,200 pot. He instantly calls. And I think actually he called off. I think it was basically putting him all in. He had about 1,000 left. I put 1,000 and he might have had 980 or something left. That's not the point. Instantly calls. And he turns over 6, 7 of diamonds. Now, I'm pretty happy with that result because I know that once that diamond doesn't come, unless that, first of all, I'm not going to bet the river if the diamond comes. I knew that in my head right away. I had a plan for the river. So if it's a non-diamond there, that's the only card that he's going to win with. It's the only card that I'm going to basically bluff off money to him where he's going to call. Because if he had hit his 7 or a 6, he was good, but of course I'm still betting the 1,000 all in. And there's just no possible way that he can call. So again, when you're playing live, you can do things really to narrow your villain's range. And there are just certain things that you can pick up about how fast they call. And normally when somebody instantly calls, it's A, pretty indicative of a draw, or B, sometimes a guy might not believe you. Sometimes, if you got a guy in there who's making a quick call, he doesn't believe that you have an ace in that case. I didn't get a feel for that guy, but say you had ace-king, and especially if you were in position, and you bet the flop and the guy called you, and now the turn came, and now you bet again because of the draw, and he called you again, and he's like, I checked the river. Especially when a guy checks blind, he thinks he's got a hand that has showdown value, and I'm betting all day long there for value. But in this case, when I'm betting into this guy out of position, I just really, really thought he had a big draw. And again, I cannot complain about the result because that's the only card that he's going to get any money in, that he's going to get any money from me on, the offsuit 9. Any other non-diamond, he's getting bluffed off the hand, and any diamond, I'm just check folding. So, again, pleased with that result. Emails, cashplays@pokerroad.com. Again, Skype me over at 323-743-8404. First email of the day here comes from Joe in Chicago. He says, during your last podcast, you mentioned that you preferred playing weak-type players. Can you go over the difference between your approach in these types of games versus action games? Well, that's a very good question. Now, when we're playing in an action game, and there aren't that many of them these days, I mean, in reality, I think the patience really is, a key virtue, especially if you're taking a shot. And I've actually done this the last couple weeks in some big games. If you're taking a shot in an action game, I think that you can almost sit there and set mine. People say, well, you should always play 100. I was playing in, a 50-100 game, and I had 10,000 in front of me. But I wasn't really comfortable with the stakes because I knew with those stack sizes, I should be making 3 bets with ace, queen, ace, jack when a crazy action guy opens in the cutoff and I'm on the button. But it's kind of a spot where I know I can sit back and win the money by basically just set mining and playing good hands. And if I were to do that and lose the hand and I go down to bust and I'm not going to rebuy, I think I almost lose some value. So I think that patience is a really, really big thing in action games. Don't get frustrated if you lose some hands. The games are usually good if you're in an action game. Whereas when you're playing against weak type players, your money comes from aggression. Your money comes from pushing them off of hands, knowing where they are at in hands, and again, extracting value like we just talked about with kind of marginal hands against secondary marginal hands. I love weak type games, especially when you continuation bet with proper types of board textures. And we've talked about what a proper type of board texture is. You raise it up pre-flop, paint, rag, king 4-3, rainbow. You bet, and you're in a very weak, tight, kind of grindish game. Now the guy calls. Well, the guy almost certainly has a king in that spot. Now, it's a little bit different, and I think it's a little bit easier to continue and 3-barrel these guys when the board comes not a king, but some sort of lower pink card like a queen or a jack. Let's say it comes jack, deuce, 3. Good board texture. You bet, the guy calls. Well, now any type of overcard that doesn't make him jacks up, if you fire again, they're just folding. And we've talked about this before. Again, king, deuce, 3 is great board texture too. It's just that you have to ask yourself, are you comfortable putting pressure on a guy when you know he probably has at least king, jack, or king, queen plus? When he calls that flop, he's basically playing his hand face up. So you have to ask yourself, well, do I want to continue to fire and get him off of that type of hand? Now, when an ace comes on the turn or on the river, it's just an absolute great spot. The reason why I like to play weak, tight games is because I think players are playing their hands face up. And as you get better in No Limit, you can really start to polarize their range and figure out how to play accordingly. And that's when we start talking about, way ahead, way behind too on the turn. When, you're pretty positive that you've bet the flop on a king, deuce, 3 board and the guy's got king, jack plus and you have ace, king. And you also know that he's a grinder, so that if you bet the turn again with your ace, king, he's going to fold. So now you check back the turn so that you can get a river call in with your ace, king. At the same token, when you don't have a king and you want him to lay down the hand and he calls the flop, he's got king, jack plus. So now you're betting the turn and maybe betting the river because you're going to put maximum pressure on him. Another interesting spot comes into these games. We talk about where players really overplay their hands. And again, extracting maximum value. Say you raise it up with pocket aces from up front out of position, and a guy calls you, and the board comes up, king, deuce, 3. And you bet out, and he calls, and it's not a drawy board. It's the same thing that you probably would do with aces in position if you think the guy is going to fold to a turn bet. But it's actually almost better sometimes when you're out of position. And I'll explain to you why. You follow this. These guys do not understand that they're overplaying king 10 or king jack when you check to them on the turn and they bet in position. They are almost habitually going to bet top pair there. So the difference is you've got aces in position, you bet the flop, the guy calls. He checks to you, you check back, he checks the river, you bet, he calls, you extract value, right? How about out of position now, this line? You bet with aces, king deuce 3, the guy calls. If you make another hefty bet again, he folds, just like if you made a hefty bet in position. He'll fold king 10. But now out of position, you check the turn. Now he bets. You call. The river's a blank, you bet. He calls. 3 streets of value. Bet, call, check, call, bet, call. And it is quite an interesting little pattern, because I think that's one of the most exploitable spots in weak tight games is guys will always bet top pair when check to on the turn because they think that they need to somehow protect their hand. They're not going through the thought process that we're going through, where what are they extracting value with on the turn? Why are you betting king 10 on the turn? Guy bets the flop on a king deuce 3 board, and now you call with king 10, and now he checks, a 7 on the turn. And tell me why you're betting king 10 now in position? Because you probably shouldn't be, unless a guy is bad enough where you can extract a turn and river bet from, say, pocket queens or pocket jacks, which is fairly rare that you're going to get 2 streets. If a guy let out on that board with jacks or queens out of position and you called, and you can get 2 streets more from him, then by all means bet turn and bet river. But normally I think you're only going to get 1 street. And I think a lot of the times the best line to take getting 1 street is checking back the turn with king 10 and then betting the river. So, again, exploitable patterns. You guys can, fool around with that stuff in weak tight games. Another email here comes from Adam. He says, during your interview with Paul Darden, I constantly heard him talk about one of the factors that goes into whether he calls or not is how good he's running. I think all of us do this subconsciously, but this was the first time I heard someone at a high level indicate that this affected their play. Do you think this is unique, or did I misunderstand what Paul was trying to say? I can understand making plays based on how opponents are running, but how you are running seems irrelevant. Well, thank you for the email, Adam. I actually had a lot of people come up to me, and we had some other emails too about the Darden thing, and they're like, well, I used to have respect for Darden, but a lot of the stuff that he said in that interview just didn't make any sense. I mean, how do you go about playing because, you're running bad or your opponent's running bad? Isn't it all math? I mean, we're talking about stud high low. I mean, these are what people are saying to me. We're talking about stud high low, and why am I going to fold this particular hand in this particular position, if the guy's running well, whereas I'm going to call or raise if the guy's running bad? It just doesn't make any sense. And I kind of want to defend Paul. It's almost like one of those subconscious things. I think when Negreanu talked about Phil Ivey not being a math player, where sometimes he'll just call because he knows, he has it. The guy, or he calls because he knows the other guy doesn't have it. Forget about the pot odds. He's just calling because he's got experience and, looks at the size of the pot and thinks there's a good enough chance the guy doesn't have it to warrant the call. I think what Paul was trying to talk about was what we've talked about many, many times before, which is just table image and momentum. If a guy is running well and it's a marginal spot to call, a case can be made that you'll fold the hand because he's going to make better decisions later on in the hand. Nothing to do with the way that the cards are going to come out. Just the fact that he's going to tend to make better decisions. Whereas if he's running bad and he's playing bad, he's going to make worse decisions later on in the hand. And I think the same thing could be said for you yourself. We're all humans. And, maybe it's less so for a professional, where, say, if he's running well, he's going to make a better decision later on in the hand in stud, or vice versa. Running bad, they're going to make a worse decision. But I think that that's what Paul was really trying to get at. And I think it really does just makes total sense. The way that he said it was, well, if you're running bad, you don't make the call. And I think that, again, the way that can be interpreted is if you're playing bad, then you want to pass up on some of those marginal situations where you'll need to, or where those marginal situations will get you into tougher decisions later on. Thank you for the email, Adam. We are going to take a little break, and we will be back right here on Cash Plays.
Cash Plays.
Previously on Poker Road Radio.
Bro, to make $100 grand or $150 grand to travel around, leave your family, and play all these fucking events, and it's not even that, bro. This is I don't give a fuck what anyone says. This is a fucking job. They tell you when the fuck to come, when to leave, when to eat, when to piss. You can't go here. You can't look at your phone. You can't do fucking shit. You're coming to playing from this. I feel like it's like back to school again, all over again, bro, right? I mean, that's what it fucking is, dude.
Don't miss a moment. Tune in to Poker Road Radio and get all the action from the tournament circuit.
Cash Plays.
And we're back here on Cash Plays. Going to go through a few more emails here. The first one comes from Byron in Arlington, Virginia. And he says, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about facing a bet into a dry side pot. Is this usually an indication of real strength? If the obvious draw gets there on the turn and an opponent bets big into a dry side pot, is this a time when you could lay down a set? Well, thank you very much for the email, Brian. And for those of you, of course, that aren't familiar with side pots are pots that begin when one or more players are all in the hand. And we're going to use a three-way example because I think it's the easiest example. Let's say you raise it up to $35 in a 5-10 game, and a guy moves in for $60 to your left, and the other guy calls. And you call. Or let's say the guy makes it 55 and the other guy calls so that you can't re-raise, and you call. So the other guy's in for 55. You three are all in for 55 in the main pot. You've got $165 in the main pot. The other guy's all in pre-flop. Now any betting that's going to go on after the flop is going to be between you and villain 2 that's not all in, and that's going to start what is called a side pot. Now the thing about side pots are there's really no purpose in bluffing into a dry side pot, with maybe one or two exceptions. Now, the question that Byron has here is that, if a guy bets in to a dry side pot when a big draw gets there, yes, that usually will indicate that guy has the hand that he is representing. Because when a side pot is dry, when we talk about how a side pot is dry, there's no money in the side pot. So for a guy to come out and bet and represent something out there, let's say you've got a very strong hand like a set, but a guy makes a big bet into a dry side pot when, say, a flush card gets there or when a straight card gets there, there's really no purpose in him bluffing you because he still has to beat the third player in the hand, especially if the third player in the hand has shown all-in strength after the flop. I'm not talking about pre-flop, but after the flop. Again, the guy, he might bluff you off your set, but he still's got to beat the other guy. Now, when you can start, the more kind of advanced concepts of when you bluff at a dry side pot is the example that I used. Let's say a guy is all in pre-flop. So you've raised it, another guy re-raises it, and the other guy calls. And you've got ace-king as the original raiser. And the board comes out 7-deuce-3. And it goes check, check. The turn's a deuce. It goes check, check. And the river's another rag. And you've got ace-king. Well, yeah, you've got showdown value, right? But you actually have to beat out two people in the hand. So I think a case can sometimes be made there where we're actually betting ace-king as a bluff to bluff the other guy who's in the side pot off of a small pocket pair. Or you could come out and bet the flop with ace-king on a 7-deuce-3 board. Because if you bet the flop, into a dry side pot, they're thinking, well, the guy's got to have a hand because why would he be betting there? I'm going to fold my pocket fives. But what people don't understand is the reason why you're betting is because your ace-king has enough showdown value that it could beat the all-in player in the hand, but it might not beat villain 2 in the hand. So ace-king might have fairly strong showdown value with the given action against one player, but against two players, it might not have as much, and there may be value in betting the flop to get a fold of fives or sixes, or you don't want to give away necessarily free cards, against some other hand. So again, that's kind of the unique situation where I think sometimes people say, well, why is he bluffing into a dry side pot? It doesn't make sense. Forget about what the specific hands are. Again, if you feel that your hand has a chance to beat the all-in player's hand for the main pot, and you feel that a bet will get villain 2, who's on the side, to fold a fair amount of times, then I think that the bet is warranted. And I hope that that helps you out, Byron. Again, combination of those two things, or multiple things. Email here comes from John. It says, my question has to do with continuation bet frequency after making a pre-flop 3-bet. I used to think that checking after 3-betting was a very strange play. Then I heard a card runner's instructor talk about how easy it is to exploit villains who continuation bet too much after re-raising pre-flop. So the question is, how often should we check the flop after 3-betting pre-flop? And how should hand strength, flop texture, relative position, image, and villain type affect our decision? Thank you for that email, John. Obviously, if you've 3-bet or 4-bet in position, or let's specifically talk about if you 3-bet in position, you can manipulate the hand in a number of different ways. Again, you can never really make blanket statements about poker, but I think that more often than not, if you 3-bet out of position and you totally miss the flop, unless it's a kamikaze board texture like 9-10 jack, with 3 spades, you're basically going to have to come out and you're forced to continuation to bet the flop. And even with bad board texture, just heads up, there's really no way that you can ever win the hand. And unless you want to totally give up, you're, again, a lot of times forced to continuation bet the flop. But again, what we talked about before. Let's say that a guy raised on the button, and you think he's got a fairly wide range, and you've got ace-9 offsuit in the small blind, and you decide to 3-bet because you think that your hand is good a fair amount of the time, and now the guy calls. The board comes out ace-5-3. Well, that's a case right there where I think that can be made where your hand, if you come out in continuation bet, you're going to play a big pot if the guy raises you, and I'm not sure if you necessarily want to stand a raise, where you can check. So I think that with marginal showdown value, when we talk about what types of boards that you don't continuation bet when you 3-bet, it's kind of the same thing as an initial raise. In that case there, I might check ace-9 a lot of the time on an ace-5-3 board out of position. In position, again, player dependent. If you've 3-bet a guy with ace-10 offsuit, and the guy's a fairly tight player, and he calls, and you're fairly certain that he's got a big pocket pair, and the board comes out ace-5-3, but you've seen him before get frisky with kings, and he can't lay it down, well, then you might want to bet there with ace-10 for value and figure out, again, how to extract the most amount of value with your medium strength hand. A lot of times I actually got caught up in a pot at Foxwoods back in the fall when you should be pot controlling some fairly big hands, I think, by checking behind in position after we 3-bet. There was a hand where a guy had opened for a very small raise in a 10 1/4 game at Foxwoods. He opened to 75, and I think I made it, and there were a couple callers, and I made a pretty hefty, I think it was a pot and a half size re-raise, which was just too much with pocket kings in the cutoff after 3 or 4 people had called, and the pot had ballooned to, almost $1,000. I only had maybe $3,000 left in my stack. The pot's $1,000. The board comes out 10-5-3. He checks to me. I've got kings. What if I had queens? In that spot, I have kings. I made again, this was when I was playing pretty bad, I think, at that time. I made maybe a $700 or $800, bet. Now he check raises me all in. So now 800, that's 26, plus another, 25 that I had in my stack. 5,100, 2,500 to call, getting 2-1 there with kings. What do? I ended up calling, and the guy had aces. Could I have checked behind there for some pot control? Could I have checked behind there maybe to induce a bluff? I think so. I definitely don't think that you are automatically obliged to make a continuation bet after 3-betting. And again, I don't think you can go wrong with some of the rules that we use after making, initial raises, where you're looking at board texture issues. You're looking at the showdown value of your hand. You're looking at if you flopped a big hand, if you flopped air, if you flopped a medium strength hand. Because a lot of times if you're 3-betting, again, you're against aggressive player, unless you're going to stack off there with one pair, I think like this guy was saying, if you're betting air a lot of the time, a guy can make a move from you from up front. And if you're not willing to stack off with, say, aces on a 9-high board, is that going to affect the way that you want to play the hand as well? And forget about aces, because usually with that given line, you are going to stack off with aces. But a hand like queens, let's say you 3-bet with kings or queens, or specifically queens, and the board comes out 10-high. Is that a pot that you're going to stack off for 250 big blinds deep or 300 big blinds deep? You might want to play a little bit of half pot control, half to extract value from a pocket nines type hand. So definitely interesting stuff, and I appreciate the email, John. Last email of the day before we wrap things up here. This comes from Donald Morgan. He says, "Great show. I listen to your podcast religiously. It's helped my game tremendously concerning the different lines to take with hands and what to think about tough situations. I was wondering if you could talk about bluffing in one of your podcasts, both on how to spot what is most likely a bluff and how to execute a successful bluff." And this is funny because I picked off a guy last week, and I also executed a successful bluff last week, and I can talk about both hands. The hand that I executed a proper bluff, and I really come from the school of thought where if you are bluffing and you think that there's a fair amount of chance that your opponent had a draw and he missed, there really isn't a need to risk that much in bluffing. You can usually get away with bluffing under half the pot. And again, probably clever villains could figure out that normally when I'm betting big on the river, I have a hand that I'm trying to extract value from. And if there's a chance I'm bluffing, it's normally I'm bluffing a little bit less because I think it's best not to risk that much when bluffing. Now, there was a hand on the blind where it got limped around 4 ways, and I had Jack-9 suited, and the board came out 10-8 deuce with 1 spade, and I had spades. So I was open-ended straight draw, the nuts, and a backdoor spade draw. I let out of the blind. Sometimes I mix it up. Sometimes I'll check raise. This time I let out of the blind, and one guy called me. And again, you don't get a complete picture as to what the guy had. He could have a 10. He could have a draw. He could have 7-9. He could have an 8 for all you know. So I'm not 100% sure what he has yet. I think the pot was limped around. I bet 100. He calls. So now the pot's, 350. Turns an offsuit 4. Kind of similar to the hand when I was talking about with that ace 10-8 in the beginning of the episode. I come out and I bet 300 again, and I'm thinking to myself, this guy, he really can't call me here, I think, just with the 10. There's no reason for him to call just with the 10 here. I think it's looking way too strong. I'm firing two barrels out of the blind. I think he's going to fold the 10. And the 4 doesn't help anything. And again, he quickly called it. I'm thinking to myself, wow, is this guy getting stubborn with the 10? I didn't have the complete information, and I didn't have the guy's range down like I did with the ace 10-8 hand from the beginning of the show. I thought that there was a fair amount of time that he might show up here with the 10, that he was just getting frustrated with a hand like king 10. So, again, I'm not 100% sure as to what the guy has. Hopefully I hit my draw at the end. 10, 8 deuce, turns a 4, river's a 10. Okay, river's a 10. Now the pot is about, I bet 300 he had called. It's about $800 to $900. Well, I'm not going to just give up on the hand. If he's got a 10, so be it. Obviously, he's going to call me. So what's the best bet to make here? Kind of that underbluff type of theory. Pot's $800 or $900. I come out and I bet 300. I make it look like a value bet. And I just think to myself, if the guy missed a draw, he's obviously going to fold. I'm making it look like I'm value betting a full house or a 10. I've shown strength on all 3 streets. And if he's got a 10, he's going to call. But if he had a 10, what would me betting 700 on the river do? It would just be spewing off money because he's not going to fold the 10 for 700. So why not risk less and get a guy who would basically fold when you put any amount of money in the pot because he missed a draw to fold? And that's exactly what I did. He actually had the same hand. He had Jack 9. He folded, and I loved it. I showed the bluff. So, again, art of bluffing, I think a lot of the times when you are fairly certain, especially when a scare card comes on the river, that the guy has a draw or he has a big hand, I think that bluffing less is the best way to go. When we talk about 3-barrel of bluffing, and, you've bluffed and you've bet a king deuce 3 board as a continuation bet, and a guy's called, and you think he's got king jack plus, and now the turn's a 9, you bet again, and he's called again, and now the river's a 10, and you're fairly certain he's got king jack or king queen, so he can't beat ace king, he can't beat king 10, he can't beat king 9. Well, do you want to bluff an amount that looks like you would make a bet for value there? I actually might bet more there because I think I'm going to get apt to get looked up by king queen if I make a half pot size bet. Whereas if I were to make a bluff there, or say make a pot size bet, there's a better chance that he may fold. Now, at the same time, when you're trying to bet for value, sometimes I take kind of that line where I'm making it look like I'm bluffing, so I bet more anyways. But if you've tagged out your opponent as weak tight, you might want to make an 80-90% pot size bet there at the end as a 3-barrel. Whatever you think that... I guess the point I'm trying to make is you should bet whatever you think can get it done as a bluff. You should probably risk the least amount that you possibly can to achieve maximum fold equity. And a lot of times, betting more does not achieve maximum fold equity. And that's why I like to endorse betting more for value. So figuring out that right amount that achieves maximum fold equity in itself is quite an art. And that's basically what you're looking to do. Catching bluffs. And, of course, this is an art in itself, but I can give you an example of a hand where I caught a bluff against a guy a couple nights ago that was a pretty relatively big fish, and we were playing like 4 or 5 handed at the time, so I raised it with queen 10 offsuit, and he called, and the board came out 10-9-7 with 2 diamonds. So I'm thinking to myself, well, this is a draw heavy board. He checks to me. Again, with this type of flop, I think I'm getting a ton of value 4-handed. I'm betting and getting called by all kinds of hands that I'm ahead of, and all kinds of draws that I'm ahead of. So I bet. He calls. I bet 80 into 100, he calls. The pot's 260 now. Now the turn is an offsuit king of diamonds. Or excuse me, the turn is a king of diamonds, so the diamond gets there. I'm like, oh man, if he's got a diamond draw, he's there. I don't have a diamond in my hand. He doesn't look too happy about it, though. He checks, and I check back. The river's an offsuit ace. So now the board is 10-9-7, king with 3 diamonds and an offsuit ace. And now he comes out and he fires a full pot size bet at me on the river. And I'm thinking to myself, wow. Given the action of this hand and the fact that this guy did not look comfortable on the turn when the diamond came, this has to be a bluff. This has got to be an 8. That's what I was thinking to myself. This guy's bluffing with an 8. He's missed an 8, and he doesn't have a pair, or he doesn't have a pair that he thinks is good, so he's bluffing. When overcards come, and I think this is the best sometimes when you're trying to, figure out how to improve your, say, bluff glass capabilities, where you want to improve picking off your bluffs. When overcards come on later streets, I think it's a little bit of a truth serum, where the guy either in that spot, he's got a flush or he's got absolutely nothing, especially when the flush card comes too on the turn and then overcards also come. You really, really can pin a guy's range down to what is the nut or what is nothing. Because when overcards come to top pair, those guys are not usually ever going to bet anything less, obviously, than 2-pair, maybe even a top 2-pair type hand. And when the flush gets there, they're not betting, he's not betting kings up there at the end, I don't think, say he had, king 9, 10, 9, 7, turns a third diamond, gives him kings up, check, rivers and ace. He's not coming out and betting full pot there. You've got to watch your betting patterns, the amount that these guys are betting. And a lot of times with inexperienced players, when they are betting more, it is bluffing. And it was just, you've got to play the entire hand back in your head. Look at the comfort level of the player if you're playing live when the obvious draw gets in there. Look to see if he's interested. A lot of times what I do, and this is a technique that I think has really, really helped me out. If the obvious draw gets there, now that in that hand that I gave an example, there's 2 draws, but let's say the board is, 7, 6, 3 with 2 diamonds, and I've got aces, without a diamond, and I bet, and the guy calls. Well, now the turn's a third diamond, it's a 9 of diamonds, okay? He checks, I check. What's really, really helped me in my live reading abilities is that I don't even look at the river card. I will not even look at the river card. After I check back the turn, I'm looking straight at the guy. Because the river really is inconsequential to me. The river really doesn't make a difference. I'm going to try to get a read if he is going to make an automatic bet on the river, if he pauses and then decides to check, or if he pauses and then makes a bet, then of course I'm going to evaluate the river. But I really like, with a hand like that where I've got showdown value with my aces and the obvious draw gets in, I just take the river out of play in terms of my live read, and it's really helped me out. Of course, it's going to come back into play when I decide whether I'm going to necessarily call, or if it gets checked to me, whether I'm going to value bet. But in terms of, again, reading the player, I've been just looking straight at him. And you just, when you start doing that and you get more experience with it, you can just kind of tell a lot of times, say, again, the board is, 7 deuce 3 with 2 diamonds, turns a 9 of diamonds, makes the obvious flush. Now the river's an ace and it gives you a set. And you haven't even looked at the river, but you're looking at him, and he comes out and he bets, and he's really unconcerned about the river. Well, he was either there with a flush on the turn, or 4-5 gets there, and obviously it gets more difficult when you need to fold a set at the end. But I'm just trying to give you an example that sometimes by looking at the guy and not looking at the board, you can tell that it didn't matter what the last card was for him. And that's normally when they hit their draw. And again, if you're not looking at the board and he seems a little bit forced with his river bet, that seems to be the times when they're bluffing. But again, if you can tag a guy down where you can just tell that the last card was totally inconsequential, then normally they're not bluffing. And again, that's a technique that I just started using, and it's really helped me out. I want to thank everybody for joining me this week. I'm actually heading off to Montana for a little bit of a vacation, and I will be back next week. So again, come in and send those voicemails in to prradio@pokerroad.com. or excuse me, not PRradio at pokerroad.com. I did it again. Cashplays at pokerroad.com. And Skype me over at 323-743-8404. Or Skype the name Bart Hanson, Hanson. Get those emails in. Help me out with my little podcast dilemma. Again, trying to figure out what the best tools are to record Skype conversations so that we can get some of the best interviews on here continuously over the next year. So we will see you next week.